Okay, let's get started. Hopefully others who plan to join will be in soon. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Erica Logan, and on behalf of the Eastern Panhandle Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, I welcome you to tonight's evening, Dissecting the West Virginia Legislative Session of 2023. Tonight, we have a great program for you, brought to you by our Social Action Committee, chaired by Kimberly Crockett and co-chaired by Dolores Foster. And we're expecting two legislative experts. We have one with us already today, Judy Ball. We are also expecting Eli Baumwell, to join us. He's hopefully just running a little bit late. Who are going to take us through some bills that are currently being discussed in our legislative session as we speak. We hope that tonight you will listen, you'll learn, and if you are so inclined, you'll contact your delegate and state senators to give them your opinion about what's being discussed. So please enjoy tonight's session. With that, I'll turn it over to Kimberly Crockett to introduce our experts.
Thank you, Erica.
I'm sorry. If I could interrupt you, I apologize. I did mean to go over a few housekeeping things.
Okay, go ahead.
I do apologize. First of all, if you do have some questions, we encourage you to put that into the chat for our host because everyone will be muted throughout the entire session this evening. Also, we will have a survey for you. We encourage you to complete that at the end of the session. We will be putting a link to that in the chat. So please, please, please complete the survey. Let us know what you think of tonight's program so that we can continue to get that feedback and continue to bring programming to our community that you appreciate and like. And we like your feedback so we can always improve what we do as we go forward. So I think with that, I've covered the housekeeping issues, and now I'll turn it over to you, Kimberly, again. Thank you.
Absolutely. Again, my name is Kimberly Crockett, and we're so excited to have two subject matter experts who will be with us today. Judy Ball is with the West Virginia League of Women Voters, and she's a subject matter expert guru in all things election related. And so we're so excited to have you with us today, Judy. I'll introduce Judy, and then before Mr. Baumwell speaks, I'll introduce him. So let's get started. Judy was born and raised in West Virginia, graduated from WVU, and because of special mentors, left West Virginia for opportunity. First for graduate school, then for a career with the federal government, mostly in Maryland around the DC area. She retired to Oregon in 2008 after more than 20 years in public service and was elected twice to the Corvallis, Oregon School Board, served on the Corvallis Planning Commission, and joined the Corvallis League of Women Voters and served on its board. And then after 10 years, the country roads of West Virginia called her home. Judy is a member of the League of Women Voters in Morgantown, where she serves on its board. And since returning to West Virginia, again, Judy has worked tirelessly on election reform. And that is what brings her to us today. Judy, thank you so much for being with us. And now we'll turn things over to Ms. Ball.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen. There we go. Okay. So, thank you. I want to thank everybody, the Deltas, for inviting me to talk at this meeting. Election law can be sort of dull, but I'll try to keep it lively, and certainly the legislature keeps it lively. One of the things that the League has done this year is we've tried to take a fresh approach to advocacy. And the reason we did that is because we needed to find a way to get a different outcome than we had been getting, because the outcomes we were getting were unsatisfying. So new approach, hopefully a different outcome. We recruited league members from across the state, and we decided to start with a year-round effort, not an effort that's just focused on the legislative session. And all of our efforts are priority driven. So this is the League Legislative Action Work Group, LLAW. And our priorities that we decided on have to do with elections. And we're focused on particular bills that are in the legislature right now. The first set of bills focus on universal absentee voting. HB 2855 is Evan Hansen's bill that he introduced in the last session. And one of the successes from LLAW is that we got Senator Caputo to introduce the same bill in the Senate, and it's SB 156. It's really important this bill is probably our highest priority, because in 2020, during the COVID epidemic, voter turnout went way up because all of our complicated absentee eligibility rules were suspended. And in 2022, just last year, those rules came back and our voter turnout plummeted, 43% in the 2022 midterms. And we only had 5 counties out of 55 that had turnout more than 50%. So only 5 counties had more people turn out to vote than stayed home. The league went looking for some real data about why registered voters in West Virginia don't vote. And it was hard to come by, but we did find a survey conducted by MIT. And what we learned that 3 out of the top 5 reasons could be addressed by universal absentee voting. And those reasons were people don't vote because they're too busy, or they have a conflict in work or family or school schedules. They don't vote because of illness or disability, despite the fact that the law says that they can. And they don't vote because of transportation problems. So these 2 bills would address all 3 of those reasons, if only we can get them on an agenda. So another of our priorities is to restore voting rights for those who were formerly incarcerated. Current law says that somebody has to complete their parole or probation before their voting rights can be restored. And that can mean years after getting out of jail or prison. These 2 bills, SB 235 and HB 2803, would restore rights upon release from incarceration. And the reason I have starred SB 235 here is it's the only one of these bills that has actually gotten any attention in the Senate so far. And in fact, when this came up on a subcommittee agenda for the Judiciary Committee, LLAW asked for amendments to SB 235 so that it would match HB 2803. That was on January 26th. And since then, the subcommittee put it on the back burner and it hasn't come back yet. We're sorry about that. Whoops. Another one of our priorities is HB 2184, Election Day voter registration. Now, this bill would establish a method for Election Day voter registration. And in fact, if you think about it, not being able to register during early voting or on election day, it penalizes people who forget to vote. And that was one of the 5 reasons we discovered for West Virginians not voting. This bill would help fix that. Although I have to tell you, it would help fix it in a rather clunky way. But it would be better than nothing. To date, no bill to permit voter registration during early voting, though, has been introduced, and that was not the case in prior sessions of the legislature. Electronic voter registration, another priority, HB 3020. This the authority for electronic voter registration already exists. It just isn't happening. So this bill would mandate that the Secretary of State would implement a single, uniform, official, centralized, interactive, computerized statewide voter registration system. That would be defined, maintained, and administered at the state level. It's really pretty straightforward. It is the 21st century, after all, so we ought to be able to do this. Our final priority is an online voter's guide. And Kim mentioned that I lived in Oregon for 10 years, and one of the great things about living in Oregon is beyond the vote by mail system is that every voter before every election gets a printed voter's guide that covers all of everything that's on your ballot. And it's really great to be able to sit down at home and go through this ahead of time before you vote, and to be able to educate yourself about who's on the ballot and what they have to say about themselves. We have no such thing. And with our newspapers declining in subscriptions, people find it hard to get information about candidates, at least accurate information about candidates. So an online voter's guide could be a real asset for voters. And an online version could be a stepping stone for a printed version. The Oregon one, by the way, it's not an expensive thing to print. They print it on really cheap, flimsy newsprint, but it is worth its weight in gold. This bill, 2952, takes a teeny tiny first step, but even that first step would be better than nothing. The reason I say it's teeny tiny is because it covers statewide races, the governor, the AG, the Secretary of State, and so forth. It wouldn't cover legislative races. So the guide would be limited, but at least it would be a start. So those were LLaw's major priorities, and there are bills for each of them, and we're pressing forward to the extent that we can exert pressure to get those bills on agendas. Now, I want to talk about the things that are not priorities. I always keep track of the bad bills and the ugly bills. So there are lots of them. Bad bills. There are absentee voting bills. There are actually 3 bills I've listed here that the league is opposing, not because they're bad bills, but because if you're going to address absentee voting in this way, it really doesn't fix the problem. 163 and 2897 we oppose because they don't address any of the procedural problems with absentee voting, and 2811 just tinkers with the eligibility categories. It doesn't even simplify them. HB 3393 would prohibit delivery of absentee ballot applications unless the voter specifically requests it. And this just doesn't make any sense. Anybody can go online and get an application for an absentee ballot. To have, somebody's grandson download an application and deliver it to his grandmother, why should that be illegal? There's nothing about getting the application and delivering it that is even approaching voter fraud. And then this bill also includes a penalty for delivery of more than 10 applications. So if the League of Women Voters wants to print out a pile of these applications and take them to the local senior center, if this bill were passed, that would be a violation of law. Second set of bad bills, voter suppression. HB 2210 would require photo ID for voting, which would eliminate many of the current forms of ID. SB 620 was just introduced. And this is not naturally a bad bill, but it reduces the number of voting precincts, increases the distance between precincts, but it doesn't have any offsetting improvements. And I understand, I just learned a few minutes ago that this bill is being taken up tomorrow in Senate. I don't know if it's in the full Judiciary Committee or in a subcommittee. And we have already sent off a letter. LLaw has already sent off a letter to Senator Trump and Senator Taylor saying, we can get behind this bill, but you really need to have some improvements. And those improvements are in SB 156, our universal absentee voting bill. And then we have SB 459, which I have labeled voter suppression on steroids. It requires a photo ID for voting. It would eliminate many of the current forms of ID. It defines legal resident, and in other words, anybody who registers to vote, very narrowly. And it restricts eligibility to register and vote based on residence and their intent to continue to reside, among other factors. And there's no duration on intent that's specified. Now, when I read this bill initially, I thought this was probably designed to eliminate university students from voting in the town where they are residing to go to school. Another possibility, even more outlandish possibly, is that if you're not going to live in West Virginia forever, you're not going to be eligible to vote. It just can't be that bad, can it? But this intent to continue to reside just jumps off the page of this bill. Third set of bad bills. Let's go back to the 19th century. This HB 2330 would repeal all the code sections permitting electronic voting, but it would continue to permit e-voting, which is possible for overseas voters and military voters and certain qualified disabled voters. This just makes no sense. And then there's HB 3394 that says voting machines have to be made in the United States. Now, that sounds like a good idea, but if you read the bill, it says that every component, it says 100% of voting machines have to be sourced, manufactured, and assembled in the United States. And I get thinking about sourced, manufactured, and assembled. Okay, well, all the plastic, all of the metal parts, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. That's a bad bill. Bad bill set number 4, runoff elections. HB 2792 would apply for selected nonpartisan races. And you know, that runoff elections don't naturally sort of stand out in this day and age, but we need to recall that runoffs were established as a mechanism to suppress the vote during Jim Crow in the South. The idea was that during the runoff, the second election, turnout would be much lower, and so the candidate that would be elected would be more likely to be the desirable one. So I think this is a bad bill. And then we have the really bad ones, the ugly ones. There's this first set that I've labeled, let's get partisan. SB 280, HB 2327, HB 3037 would convert the election of selected officials that should be acting in a nonpartisan way. Their elections would go from nonpartisan to partisan. And then SB 280 would include judicial elections, all kinds of justices and judges. And then HB 2327 and 3037 would roll in school boards, should be elected on a partisan basis. And then finally, probably my bottom of the barrel 2 bills are the proposals to elect school superintendents, HB 2561 and HB 3029. These bills would elect county school superintendents for fixed terms. It would strip the authority from school boards to hire and fire superintendents, and that is a fundamental function of school boards. And if you read the bills, you find out that the only requirement to be a school superintendent under these bills is to live in the county where they would serve. There is no educational credential required whatsoever. And I have to wonder if this is another substitute for Amendment 4, which is, of course, the voters voted down. So that's where we are. That's what we've been following. The whole idea behind our law and what the League of Women Voters has been doing is act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does. And if we don't act as if what we do makes a difference, then it never will. And here's my contact information. I encourage anybody to contact me anytime. Thank you.
Hello, Judy. We did get one comment in the chat, and I wanted to pose that in the form of a question for you, and it was about low voter turnout.
Yes.
Do we know how much of low voter turnout is attributed to voting difficulties versus indifference?
Well, when we looked, I just recently published an op-ed in the Charleston Gazette and the Dominion Post about this. When there's a survey that's conducted by MIT after every presidential election. Unfortunately, it's not done after midterms. And MIT goes out and surveys a representative sample of voters, registered voters in every state. It's a sort of survey that no local organization could possibly mount. It's very well done. It's highly reputable. And what we found is that, yes, there is a lot of voter non-voters who say that they don't vote because they don't like the candidates, or they sort of don't feel connected to the system. But the issues that I cited, many of the issues that I cited, show up in West Virginia more than they do in the nation, that have to do with people don't vote because of transportation issues, because of illness or disability, or because of conflicts that they need a way to overcome those conflicts. And absentee voting would help them do that. And that's one of the reasons that we press for that. The other thing I would say is that I don't think we can naturally conclude that when people say that they don't care, they don't like the candidates, that may be a reflection of not knowing enough about the candidates. It may be a reflection of not having good information about the candidates. In some places, this past election, in the midterms, there were simply a lot of races that were uncontested, which has to have a suppressing effect on turnout. So there are many different things that we can do. This is not going to get solved with, there's no magic wand, but there are many different things that we can do that could have a positive impact. And that's what we're trying to press for.
Thank you.
I'm trying to turn the share off. Stop share. There we go.
Thank you, Judy.
Are there other questions?
There was another question. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Were there unusually high number of incidents of voter fraud while we were dealing with the COVID shutdown during the election cycle that causes concern about the use of absentee voting?
In a word, no. Even the public officials in West Virginia who have been most opposed to absentee voting, and I can put the Secretary of State very close to the top of the list, have come out and said it was a secure election. There were no major instances of voter fraud. And the few instances that happened got caught and dealt with, but nothing happened that would have changed the outcome. It didn't happen here. It didn't happen in Pennsylvania. It didn't happen in Georgia. It didn't happen in California. It didn't happen anywhere. I mean, there have been oodles of court cases over this. And there's no evidence that voter fraud was an issue in the COVID year.
And then there was one last question. The really bad bills seem designed to suppress the vote. Is there any real indication whose vote they're attempting to suppress?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's funny because in 2020, when absentee voting was freely available, that's when the Republicans in the legislature became a supermajority. And all the statewide races were captured by Republican candidates. And I'm not talking about this as a political person, but rather as an observer of the process. So we often see that it is the Republicans in the legislature who are opposed to making elections more free and open. And I look at the results of the 2020 election and say, well, didn't you benefit by free and open elections? This doesn't make any sense to me. I expect people to act rationally, and rationally means you do what benefits you. And they don't seem to look at it that way. And I don't know why.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your expertise in this area.
Kim?
Yes.
Let me just interrupt you. We do have one more question that just came through, if I could interject.
Oh, please.
Judy, the question came through, could SB 459 with the quote intent to reside language also inadvertently target or hurt military residents?
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That bill is, in my opinion, and don't forget, you're hearing my opinion because I've been reading these bills on a daily basis and accumulating a record of them. In my opinion, that bill is written with so loosely that it's hard to say who it would affect and whether it would exclude military voters or not. If we have military voters who are residents of West Virginia who vote absentee because they're not physically located here. I don't think this bill would exclude them, but the way it's written, it's hard to say. The intent to reside piece is just, and the fact that it has no time limit on it, it just blew me away when I read it. I couldn't understand what the bill was trying to do, but it had to be bad.
Any other questions?
No more questions in the chat, Kim.
All right. Judy, I don't know if you're going to stick with us, but if other questions come in, hopefully you'll be with us at the end so you can chime in again if there are any additional questions. We'd like to shift our focus now over to Eli Baumwell. As Advocacy Director, Eli helps manage the ACLU West Virginia's political advocacy efforts and develop its policy platform and priorities. He also serves as ACLU's West Virginia's chief lobbyist at the West Virginia legislature. There, he drafts legislation and works with legislators to help safeguard our civil liberties. A graduate of Cornell University, Eli holds a JD, a legal degree, and a master's degree in public and international affairs from the University of Pittsburgh. He worked as an attorney representing clients in Social Security disability cases before joining ACLU West Virginia. He lives in Charleston with his wife and his triplet sons, which sounds like a lot of work. Welcome, Eli. We're very excited to have you with us today. We're hoping you can help us make heads or tails of this legislative session and what's going on. Are you with us, Eli? Let's get you off mute. You might have to unmute yourself, Eli. We've given you host ability so that you can control your
There
audio.
we go. All right. Thank you. Yep, it was not letting me, and then it was. So thank you very much. I'm with you, and apologies for not being on a little bit sooner. I just frankly lost the email that had the link to the Zoom. 21st
Well,
century problems.
we're glad you're with us now.
Yeah, well, I am too, and so again, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about some of this, and I've got sort of a bit of an outline here I'm going to go through, and please stop, interrupt if there are questions or if I'm going on a tangent that isn't helpful. But you know, I like to start with just a brief overview of the legislative process, because I feel like sometimes those of us who are in the field start talking about the process, and we forget that those of us who aren't doing this on a day-to-day basis, we forget it. Don't always know all of the ins and outs. So just a quick rundown of the legislative process for everyone here. And again, I won't belabor points, and I apologize if it's or remedial for some folks here. So the first step in the process is a bill has to be introduced, and that has to be done by one of the elected representatives, by a senator or delegate. A lot of times they get the ideas from constituents, from special interest groups. Sometimes it's their own idea, but they go ahead and they either write the language, or they might go down to the bill drafting folks who help other legislators. I've got this idea, I would like this to be a bill, and they'll draft it into legislative language. So that's the first step. Once a bill is introduced, it'll be assigned to various committees. So a bill, you know, and then if a bill starts in the House of Delegates, it'll be assigned to House committees. If it starts in the Senate, it'll be assigned to Senate committees. And usually it's based on the subject area. Sometimes it's one committee, sometimes it's two. Usually if you see it assigned to 3 committees, and that doesn't happen very often, it's a pretty good sign that leadership doesn't want that bill to go anywhere. But it'll be assigned to committees, and what will happen in the committee process is an attorney will explain what the bill does to a select group of the legislators, and answer any questions that they have. They'll also have a chance to call up witnesses to amend the bill, and sort of run through that process. If it's assigned to 2 committees, after it gets passed out of one committee, it'll go to the next. Otherwise, it'll go to the floor. And again, either that's the House or Senate floor, depending on what the bill is. And there it has to be typically be read on 3 separate days. And when we say read, you know, there's this idea that means someone's going to actually sit down and read the whole bill. Usually it just means acknowledging that this bill is in the system. So they'll say it's House bill, whatever, on first reading. Second reading is typically where they're allowed to amend the bill. And then third reading is where they'll hear it one last time, they'll debate it, and they'll vote on the final passage of the bill. Once it gets passed out of one chamber, it's got to go to the other side. So if it's a House bill, it goes to the Senate. The Senate bill goes to the House, and it's got to go through the whole process again. Committees, 3 readings, and that whole process. So that's our typical process for passing a bill. And again, some of you, I know that's remedial. Some of you, again, maybe less familiar with this, so I want to start there. Part of the reason I want to start there is because one of the things I was asked to talk about is some of the rule suspensions that have been going on this particular session. This has been a little bit unusual. So even though the Constitution, the state Constitution actually has rules on how bills have to be passed, including things like reading the bill on 3 separate days, our Constitution also allows us to suspend those constitutional rules by a vote of a supermajority, by a vote of 2/3 of the legislature or the chamber involved. So that doesn't come up that often, though we've seen it come up more now that we have supermajorities of one party in each chamber. And so I want to talk specifically about what's happened this year, because this has been an issue this year. So on the very first day of the legislative session, when no bill has been formally publicly introduced, people haven't had a chance to review anything, the West Virginia Senate passed out 23 bills. That included a couple that I'll talk about in a little bit, most notably the Anti-Racism Act of 2023, which is a very George Orwell type name in terms of what it actually does. It also included the bill that completely reorganizes West Virginia's DHHR system. That's a pretty weighty, heavy topic. And so to pass it out on the first day without any public input, without any public insight, that's a pretty major breach of sort of our assumption of an open and transparent government process, as well as just a more thoughtful government process that we want. So we saw that all happen. We also saw that about 2 weeks ago, on a Thursday afternoon, the Senate went into what's called a split session. So they usually go in at 11 a.m. each morning, and they'll have their floor session. And on one Thursday afternoon, they came in for a afternoon session. So they said, we're coming back in at afternoon. And they did the same thing. They suspended all the constitutional rules on reading a bill 3 days and passed out the Senate's version of these massive income tax cuts that they want to pass. So they did that again without any of that sort of normal public notice that we talk about, without any of the sort of the debate and amendment stage. It just, boom, it's done and it's out of one of the chambers and onto the next part of that process. So that has happened a bunch of times. That is very unusual. It's very atypical for a legislature. And if I can editorialize a little bit, it's a very undemocratic process, and it's a process that really takes away the transparency that we should expect from our government. So I wanted to sort of briefly explain to people about that, because I know that has come up. And then the last thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about some of the bills that we're following. And you know, one of the joys of being the ACLU in West Virginia is that we never have a dull day. Our tracking list is currently up to about 600 bills. I will not bore you all with 600 bills worth of legislation. Some of them Judy already covered. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the big things that we have been watching, either because they're moving, we've heard that they may move this year. And then again, I'm happy to field questions. So again, the first one I'll talk about is this Senate Bill 130, and that's that Anti-Racism Act of 2023. This is also what we call the classroom censorship bill. Other people may know it by what it's being branded by our opposition, which is the critical race theory bill. This is the bill that would restrict the use of critical race theory, anti-racism training, implicit bias trainings in schools. Now, this particular bill did pass both chambers last year. It passed the House, and then it went to the Senate, and the Senate passed this bill. But they passed this bill 2 minutes past midnight, which means it did on the last day of session, which means it did not count and it did not actually fully pass by 2 minutes. Now, again, then we had this little thing called the election. We may have heard of it. So we had a whole bunch of turnover, some new representatives, and the Senate president decided, well, hey, we came close to passing before. We don't need to re-examine this again. Our new representatives don't need to examine this again. We're just going to knock it out in day one. So on the very first day again, they suspended constitutional rules and they kicked it out of the Senate. So it had already gone through one half the process on the very first day of session, which is pretty scary. It's already been through one of the two committees it was assigned to in the House of Delegates, and that was the House Education Committee. So it is pending in its last committee before it goes for a final vote in the House of Delegates and would be passed altogether. So I do want to sort of highlight that. A little bit about this bill. This is a bill that in its current form is about as watered down as these anti-critical race theory bills get. And I do want to be pretty clear about this. It is a pretty watered down bill in terms of what it actually does do. It says that you can't have people aver or swear to or force them to say that there are biases or that there are inherent advantages or privileges. Now, again, even when we do things like implicit bias training, we're not asking anyone to actually aver or say to it. We're trying to give them information. So whether it's in class or it's these sort of background trainings, it doesn't do a whole lot in terms of what it actually restricts. What it does do is create a pretty significant killing effect. So teachers know that this is there, administrators know that this is there, and they are very worried if this gets passed. Hey, am I breaking the law? And to make this worse, we've got a private complaint and a private cause of action. So any parent, any teacher, any administrator can come in and initiate a complaint under this law, which means even if you're not breaking it, even if you are complying fully with the law, you're going to have people coming in and issuing these complaints about this bill or about the sort of trainings or education that you're providing. And the easier way to avoid complaints and investigations and all of that red tape and work is to just not touch the topic altogether. And that's all they need to do, is get people afraid to even touch the topic. And even in its watered down version, that's what this will do. And it'll keep us from talking about these really important and necessary conversations about race, about disparities in society, and about systemic problems that we have that need to be going on. So it's still a bad bill, even in this form, but that's where it is. And again, I think it's important to talk a little bit about that bill and where it is right now.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about that bill, Eli, before you move on?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You mentioned that it was assigned to two committees and it had already gone through the Education Committee. Can you explain to our viewers today the other committee that it is in front of right now? And then what, if any, action can individuals take, unless you're going to address that later? I hate to interrupt you.
Please interrupt. And that is a very good question. So it is pending in front of the House Judiciary Committee. That's the last committee it has to go through before to go to the House for a final floor vote. And the best action to take is to call any and every member of that House Judiciary Committee, particularly the chairman, and say, hey, we don't want this. This is bad, and here's why it's bad. And again, I think it's bad because even in this watered down form, it is going to chill people and scare people away from even having these conversations. So even in those watered down forms, but that's where it is. That's what needs to happen. I also want to point out that I am concerned because the bill's initial sponsor, back when this was started in the House in 2022, is Chris Pritt, Delegate Chris Pritt, and he is on the House Judiciary Committee. And again, in a committee, you can offer amendments. And I am concerned that if this goes to the Judiciary Committee, they will amend it and make it even worse before it goes up for a final vote. So even though we can say, hey, it's as not bad as it can be right now, I cannot promise you it'll stay as not bad all the way through this process. So that's another reason we don't want to see the House Judiciary Committee even take it up. We just want them to yep.
Excuse me for interrupting. You're being asked to repeat the number of the
Senate Bill 130.
Yep. Senate Bill 130. Yep. 130. Okay, any other questions about that bill before I move on?
No, thank you for taking those questions.
Yeah, no problem. So the next one we'll talk about, and there are several bills out there, so I'm not going to give you a bill number because there are about a half dozen or even more of these, are what we call the Religious Freedom Restoration Act bills. This was a really big topic back in 2016. It was defeated very narrowly at the last minute and sort of fell to the back burner, and now it is coming back up. And so the Religious Freedom Restoration Act basically would change things to say that any supposed burden on religion has to be viewed in the strictest sense possible. And where and why this has come up now is really when it comes to LGBTQ discrimination issues. And so again, we have seen these Religious Freedom Restoration Act bills used to try to deny marriage licenses to people who are legally able to marry, to deny services and businesses to people who are legally married. But again, this would apply to any religious objection anyone had. So this could apply to you and a coworker are sharing, or you and a friend are sharing a hotel room, and they decide that it is against their religious beliefs that you and whoever this person is should share a room together. That person would be able to deny you that service. It could apply to a whole bunch of different things. It is religion used as a sword, not as a shield. And so it is a highly concerning thing. There's a lot of talk that this is going to be brought back up this year. And so we are watching all of these very closely. Again, we haven't seen any of them get on an agenda yet, but from being in the Capitol, from doing the lobbying we're doing, we have heard that this is one of the priorities to try to get through again this year. So we're watching all of the different iterations of this particular bill. The next thing, and again, if there's a question, I'll come back and I can answer questions with that. The ACLU West Virginia does a lot on reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And there is a bill that was put on an agenda just today. Now, they didn't actually take it up, but we've been told it's coming back on Tuesday. This is Senate Bill 552, and this has to do with the use of mifepristone, which is the drug that allows people to terminate a pregnancy through medication. And there is some research out there that says that if you take, and I believe it's estrogen, I believe is what it is, you can, and you've taken mifepristone, which is a 2-drug course, you can reverse that. So you take the first drug, then you can take the second, and you may be able to reverse that. And it is dangerous. It has caused people to bleed out. It is not recommended by the FDA to try to quote reverse this. And West Virginia already passed a law a couple of years ago requiring doctors to give this dangerous false information. And this bill that was coming up today would have doubled down on the propaganda by requiring doctors to give a website and a hotline number that leads to quack science. And I do not use the word lightly. I do not call a lot of science quack, but this is flat out quack science. It would have required doctors to offer what they call neonatal hospice service, where basically they offer to have a pregnant person carry a non-viable pregnancy to term, give birth, just to watch that fetus or baby die. And they're offering that as an alternative for people, and requiring doctors to offer that as an alternative, forcing people to go through this sort of psychological care. They are removing language telling people about the danger of this process. They're also removing liability protection so that when doctors are forced to give this false information, previously they couldn't be sued. Now they could be sued when people get hurt because they take this false and dangerous information. So that's a bill that actually got an agenda. We've been told it's going to be taken up again next week. And then again, that's Senate Bill 552. That has to do with reproductive rights. 2 bills I'm sort of lumping together here have to do with trying to erode the church-state separation, particularly in our schools. The first bill is Senate Bill 251. That has already passed all the way through the Senate, pending in front of the House Education Committee now. This is a bill that would require every school to have in a very visible place the phrase "In God We Trust," which is the national motto. And so again, this is a great shout out for people who believe in God, but can really make students who don't, or who maybe don't feel like when we say "In God We Trust," we're talking about the God that they believe in. It can really make them feel uncomfortable and a little bit excluded. But the Senate has already passed this bill. The other bill that we're looking at is Senate Bill 619. This is a bill that would allow intelligent design, which is basically another version of creation theory, packaged a little bit more neatly, to be taught in schools. That has already been ruled unconstitutional. This has been addressed by our court, but this bill would allow it to be taught anyway. I have been told by the sponsor of that bill and by the Senate Education Committee they are intending to look at that bill. So it hasn't been brought up in a committee yet, but I've been told that they are intending to bring it up sometime very soon. And again, that's Senate Bill 619. And these are all meant to erode that wall of separation between church and state and make sure that everyone can have their own faith beliefs, whatever they are, without the government coercing various faith beliefs on them. That's another one that we're really watching closely. The last bill that I want to talk about very briefly, and again, there are several, so I'm not going to give you a bill number for this because nothing's been brought up. There has been a lot of talk this session about reinstituting the death penalty here in West Virginia. For, at this point, nearly 70 years, West Virginia has not had a death penalty. Or I'm sorry, rather nearly 60 years, West Virginia has not had a death penalty. And there are people who want to bring it back after all that time, as the rest of the country and the rest of the world moves away from using the death penalty. People want to bring it back. Again, I won't belabor the point, but we know that innocent people, when there's death penalty, do get executed. We know that the death penalty doesn't actually stop people from committing crimes. So it is a really bad and dangerous piece of legislation. Now, the good news is there was a lot of talk at the beginning of this legislative session about that. It seems to have largely fizzled out, but I remain on high alert because I know that at least some people in the leadership teams are interested in this and would be willing to try to bring it back. So I want to put it on everyone's radar that, hey, this is something people are talking about. And the more they hear that folks do not want this, that it is dangerous, that it is bad, that it is wrong for West Virginia, the less likely it is that we will see it. So those are the bills that I want to talk about. That's a little bit of the stuff I had, and so I want to give a little bit of time for any questions that anyone else may have here.
Eli, thank you so much. There was one question that came early on in your presentation, and the question is, and I'll just read it verbatim, are the committees the same titles in both chambers?
They are not. So some of them are. So we do have, for example, in the Senate, an education committee, a judiciary committee, a government organization committee. Those are the same in both chambers. When you get down to what they call either the minor committees or now they call them the subject matter committees, that's where you tend to see a little bit more difference. So each chamber is able to create their own committees. They are not exactly mirror images of each other. Though again, particularly for these more major committees, you do tend to see them be the same.
We also got a comment. It's not a question, but I think they wanted the other folks on the session to know. A comment from one of our participants was that Pennsylvania's governor just renounced the death penalty.
Right, and we have seen that used, by executive action. So, for example, the federal, I think this is a lot of where this comes from, is that Trumpism spilling over. So the federal government still has the death penalty, and for I believe it's 20-some years it had not been used. And under Donald Trump, they reinstituted using the death penalty. So we have in other places the executive branch be part of that. Now here in West Virginia, again, it's prohibited by the legislative branch. And that's a stronger, more secure way of keeping it from being used. That's certainly how we want to keep things here in West Virginia. But it is good to know that in Pennsylvania, that is one of the things that they've done.
Okay, the questions are rolling in now. First question, do you recommend Legiscan as a source of information?
It's a good source of information. I always recommend going to the West Virginia Legislature's website and doing that, and then following the groups who are advocating. I will be totally honest here. I'll go probably a little bit into the weeds here. I get pitched all the time these various websites and services that can track legislation for us, and I generally don't use it because West Virginia is behind the time. So the information that they put online is usually anywhere from 12 to 24 hours behind what's actually going on. So your advocacy groups who are there in the Capitol following and working this legislation are going to have real-time information a lot more than these other organizations. Now again, Legiscan is great. It'll keep up with whatever gets put online. The West Virginia Legislative website will put stuff online. But the groups, we are the ones there, and we get to hear stuff before they ever put it online. So that's my suggestion always.
Eli, can you take a second and can you tell them what the ACLU does?
Thank you. That's a good question. I probably could have started this. So the ACLU, we are a nonprofit. We are a nonpartisan organization, and our mission is very broad. So our mission is to protect and expand the rights and liberties guaranteed under both the West Virginia and the U.S. Constitution. And a focus of that is particularly on groups and individuals that have been traditionally denied those rights and protections. So that covers a broad range of things, everything from freedom of speech, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, privacy and technology, reproductive justice, racial justice, and that's just scratching the surface of the issues that we cover. And we do this work through three main areas. So we do it through community engagement and organizing. We do it through litigation. So we sue the government a lot. I always like to brag that no organization has been in front of the United States Supreme Court more than the ACLU, other than the United States Department of Justice, which defends all the suits against the government. So we sue the government a lot. And we do it through lobbying and advocacy. And again, that's the area that I work in. So that's what the ACLU does.
And you referenced that you all track these, but on your website, people can log into the ACLU West Virginia website and see a list of the bills that are being tracked. Is that right?
That's correct. So we do put on our website, it's acluwv.org. There's my little pitch. Right on our top banner, it says our legislative tracker. And you can go there, and it is a big, long, like I said, it is now about 600 bills deep list. We try to update it every day. Of all the bills that have been introduced, a brief description of what the bill does and what our position is. And you know, it's all there for people, it's all there publicly.
Okay.
Eli, one person in the chat wanted to know, is there a visual graphic of all of the committees that could be found online?
So the easiest way is I don't know if there's a visual graphic, but at the West Virginia Legislature's website. So if you go to the West Virginia Legislature's website, and that's wvlegislature.gov. When you go to that website, you're going to wind up with a homepage, and then there's sort of right below that a yellow banner that's got House, or it's got Senate and then House. And if you scroll over those, it'll drop down some menus, and then I think the third option down on each of them is committees. And if you click on that, it's going to list all the committees for each of those chambers, and that will give you the list of those committees. You can click on that list to see the members of the committees. You can also, off to the side, it'll tell you the agenda. It'll show you the most recent agenda for that committee, or the most up. The agenda might be coming up for that committee. So that's the easiest way to find all of that.
Another comment was HB 2007, will it die in Senate?
2007, and I think I may have neglected to talk about that. That's a good question. It was on my outline here, and I just, as I was reading it, missed over it. So I want to very briefly, HB 2007, for folks who are not familiar with this is a bill that would prevent providers from providing gender affirming care. This is medical care for transgender individuals to minors. Now, again, I want to be very clear about this because the bill has changed a little bit. It initially started as just surgery, which we still don't like from a messaging standpoint, but the reality is no one is providing surgery to minors. That's the reality. Now it covers medication, and they do provide medication to minors. They may provide puberty blockers, give people who are going through puberty, maybe developing characteristics that may be actually mentally harmful, to give them more time to work with medical providers on this. It may also include hormone replacement therapy, where you can actually get hormones consistent with your gender identity. Again, there's a very rigid and careful medical process providers go through to provide that care. And so that is something that's being debated to be banned altogether here in West Virginia. And again, for folks who may not be familiar with this, I just have to plug that this is really dangerous, because the statistics show us that minors who do not get the care are a lot more likely to wind up committing suicide. So we're talking about actual genocide here. We're talking about killing people when we don't provide them with this sort of care. It is dangerous, and it is not for our legislators to be discriminating because they disagree with this idea of gender identity, which is widely recognized by the international medical community. So that's a little bit about that bill. It is in the Senate. We are working to try to get to die in the Senate. I will tell folks realistically, it is an uphill battle. There was a lot of pressure to do this. There are a lot of legislators who think that this is a great red meat piece of bill. It's going to get out the voters. It's going to, show them that, hey, West Virginia is a good conservative state, and it is dangerous and deadly. And right now, there are a couple people in leadership positions who know this, who understand it, and they are under immense pressure within their own party to run this. And so the more support that they get from their constituents, from community members here in West Virginia saying, no, we do not want this, the more likely they are to hold the line. And that is the only way we are going to keep this from going.
That's actually a very good segue, I think, Eli, to talk about really just the mental health of all West Virginians as we look at this legislative session in particular. It can be very daunting. You've given us, you and Judy both, a list of really concerning bills as they relate to suppression of the vote, the right to vote, as well as suppression of our civil liberties. And so moving forward, what can you tell, what can we do, Eli? Like give us the charge as we move out of this webinar. There's a lot on our agenda that needs to be addressed, and it can feel overwhelming for us as individuals at times. But, what can we on our own as individuals do to make an impact in these areas?
So I think that the big thing is be in contact with your representatives. And, I know that sounds like really generic, patronizing advice. And I would have told you, when I started this work 8 years ago, I would have probably rolled my eyes and told you that's really generic, patronizing advice. But I can promise you what I have seen over 8 years of doing this lobbying is West Virginia has a very small community. We've got very small legislative districts, and we have very responsive legislators, and they do listen to their constituents.
What is the order of preference? What's the order of preference of how we talk to our legislators directly?
So, I always find calls to probably be the best, and I'm gonna have to equivocate a little bit here in that sometimes lobbying organizations will do these call campaigns. Everyone call your legislator, and they know that. And when they get a whole bunch of calls on the same bill over and over again, well, hey, this is being driven by this organization, and that's great. They've got this many members, but okay. But when they're getting sort of the more organic calls, when you're not seeing that call to action and just calling your own, it means someone cared enough to actually look up this bill and say, hey, I care. So listen to us now, before there's a call to action and call. I think it's always the first thing. Letters, handwritten letters really matter because no one sends those anymore. So when you get a handwritten letter, it's different, it's unique. Come down and visit the Capitol. And again, this is a personal invitation. People can call me. My cell phone is listed publicly. My email is listed publicly. Call me. If you come down to the Capitol in person, I will help you find your representatives, and I will help you talk to your representatives. Talk to them in person, or wait till they're in your district. They come home most weekends. Give them a call at their home. So those are great. Emails is an okay way to contact people. I'll tell you, a lot of them don't read emails, or if they do, it's once a week, and they sort of just skim through them all. So email works, but it's not as effective as some of those other tools.
Okay, that's very helpful. Judy, do you have anything to add to that?
It's interesting that Eli should give this advice, because one of the things that LWA is doing is we have had the State League put together what we call an enhanced roster, so that we have now a spreadsheet that has the senatorial districts and the House districts for every single member of the League of Women Voters coded into it, so that when there's a bill coming up that we want to get some action on, we already have that information available. And we just went through this process of Lynn Winmeyer sent out a whole slew of emails to League members who live in districts that are represented on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and asking them to contact their senators to try to get SB 156 onto the agenda, because we want Senator Trump, who's the chair, to know that there are people out in West Virginia pushing members of his committee to take up this bill.
All right.
So that's exactly the method. It's I was sort of following in the footsteps of the indivisible folks, who said, focus on the people in the districts, not everybody. Focus on the entire legislature, but focus on your senators, your delegates. They're more likely to listen to you.
Okay. And then Eli, yes.
I want to just interject and say that we did have some comments, that we still have comments coming through. And there was someone who put a thoughtful comment, mentioned, being in Eastern Panhandle, it's extra hard to go to Charleston, but suggested sending postcards encouraging the efforts of our elected officials.
It's a great idea. It's a great
Absolutely.
idea.
I mean, any contact they get is good. And certainly, again, our Eastern Panhandle representatives know that it is a hard haul to get out there. And when they get those postcards, when they get those letters, when they get these things, they do pay attention. Again, it tells them that someone has taken that effort and that they care about this particular bill. Absolutely.
One last question. There were a couple of issues that you brought up, and there were so many bills presented that you couldn't even give us a number. When people reach out to their representatives, can they just reference the general topic of the bill, or do they have to be specific about Senate bills and House bill numbers? Can they just say, you know, I'm against the I can't remember how you phrased it, the Religious Freedom Act, Freedom Restoration
Act, yeah, RFRA.
Yeah.
RFRA, yeah. No, I mean, if you write a letter and say I'm against RFRA, everyone there will know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
And you know, again, they may not remember every single bill number, you know, in the same way that I'm not gonna go through and look at every single bill number, but they know what you're talking about. And so that is absolutely an effective way of communicating when we talk about these sort of things.
Excellent.
There's one question, and I know we're going towards wrapping things up, but this was a good question. We talked a lot about some of the bad bills, but are there any good bills to give us some hope?
Yeah, so I mean, there are good bills. There are good bills too, and I think Judy talked about one of the best ones, which I think is this restoration of voting rights for people on parole and probation. You know, again, I'll tell you, our organization, we think that frankly, no matter where you are in the criminal legal process, you ought to be able to vote. You're a U.S. citizen, you ought to be able to vote. Period. The end. But certainly, people on parole and probation, they are out in community. They're trying to rebuild their lives. That's what parole and probation is about. Part of that is rebuilding a civic life. A lot of times these people are working, they are paying tax. This is taxation without representation if they can't vote. Very basic. So that is something that's out there that is good. You know, again, I suggest looking at our tracker, because you'll find that there are a lot of bills out there that we support. A lot of them are sort of minor, you know, they're not major policy changes. They're not sort of those landmark transformational things that I would love to see going. But there are usually some good things that go through. So check it out, because they're there.
Excellent. And I think that bill you referenced, House Bill 235, right?
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Eli, for being with us. And just in the background, I want to also thank Molly Kennedy, your community outreach coordinator, who was fantastic in helping to connect us. And Judy Ball, you know, I want to thank you again too. You always bring wonderful words of expertise in the area of voting. I'm going to turn things over to Dolores Foster, who's my co-chair, just for some closing remarks, and thank you to the individuals who registered and who attended our event.
Yes.
Dolores?
Yes. Thank you, Kimberly, very much. And on behalf of the Eastern Panhandle Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated, our president, Erica Logan, and our chairperson, Kimberly Crockett, I would like to join Kimberly in thanking Ms. Ball and Mr. Baumwell for your expertise tonight. I never thought it could be so interesting, but thank you for making it a very interesting webinar, and for sharing your expertise. And also I want to thank our technology chairperson, Tammy Togan. Tammy, we thank you for always being available to us and for us as we try to do these webinars. I know it takes the time away from some other things that you would like to do. And for those of you in the listening audience or the viewing audience who have joined us tonight, we thank you. We thank you for your participation. The questions were really in depth, and we thank both of our persons, Judy and Eli, for answering those questions in such a very simple way. Even for me, it made it very easy. And once again, for those of you who are following us, and particularly following the Social Action Committee, we thank you. We thank you very much. And I'm giving it back to our president or our chairperson of the Social Action to have the very, very last closing remarks, if you want to. I
just wanted to remind you all that there is There's a survey in the chat. We'd ask that you just take a minute to be responsive to a couple of questions. It'll just help us with our programming so that we can continue to bring information to the community that would be helpful, particularly in areas related to social action. So Erica, is there a final word you'd like to have?
I think you all have said it all.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just wish everyone a very good evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. So long.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.